Moreover, like great corporations today, they're involved in lobbying parliaments at home. The very first case in the world of corporate corruption was in 1695, when the East India Company is caught giving share options to MPs to increase their monopoly. So the sort of activity that we see in the 20th century, when, for example, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company gets the CIA and MI6 to do a coup in Iran, to bring down Mossadegh, who's trying to nationalize the Persian oil fields, that sort of operation sees its genesis for the very first time in the East India Company. Later on, in the 1950s, we have United Fruit, bringing about a coup in Guatemala because the Guatemalan socialist government is threatening to nationalize the United Fruit Company's land. That coup, also funded by the CIA, brought about the phrase Banana Republic. Later in 1977, ITT lobbies the CIA to produce a coup in Chile, leading to the nastiest of all the juntas in South American history. So this idea that great corporations can interfere in politics, not just through lobbying and shareholder power and the power of money, but also through influencing parliaments and changing the entire strategies of nations. This originates in the East India Company. It is the original multinational corporation. And just like multinational corporations today can bring great wealth, but also have the possibility of acting in extremely devious and ruthless ways, so the company is the first great multinational to take that course.
William, that was an absolutely brilliant conversation. What was it like being in the British Library? Is this where you did much of your research and looked at all of the archives? Is this where the book came together?
Well, it's not just one book, Sanjoy. The Anarchy is the final volume of a quartet, the company quartet, that I've been working on since 1999. And really the archive of the East India Company is divided between two different places. The London half of operations, in other words, the stuff that was in the London head office, is now in the British Library. But the Calcutta end of operations, the headquarters in India, is now in the Delhi National Archives. And anyone really wanting to study the company has to go to both places. What you get in London is what they wanted the head office to hear. But you also get all the machinations of the head office. While in Delhi, you get all the stuff they didn't want the directors to know, the money they were making on the side and all that sort of stuff. So when you put the two halves together, you get the full picture, or at least half the picture.
What Malini mentioned in her comments was that there's so much of this material still sitting in the basement, untouched, waiting to be perhaps discovered or uncovered. Is that what you found when you were going through the records?
Well, I mean, relatively, that's much more the case with the Indian National Archives in Delhi, which are far less trawled through than London ones. I mean, a good proportion of the material in London is quite well catalogued and quite well known, though the closer you get to the Indian sources, the Persian material and the Urdu material and the material in languages other than Urdu and Persian, Bengali and so on, the more uncovered material there is. But in Delhi, there is, vast archives still. When I first started on this material with The Last Mughal, we found the entire archives of the 1857 uprising sitting in boxes in the basement, which literally no one had worked on. There are very few Urdu scholars had touched some of the newspaper material. But the great mass of this incredibly important records of the revolutionaries who led the greatest uprising against colonialism was virtually untouched. And so, I mean, this is one of the exciting things about working on this, bizarrely, is in both cases how much you can still discover as an individual working on this hugely important subject.
Willie, given that there's so much of information in archives, both in India and in Britain, in the last two sessions we've had on JLF London, both panels have sort of referred to the fact that none of this is actually ever taught in history books, certainly not in the UK, And in fact, Abir Mukherjee was talking about how the Bengal famine, which wiped out 3 million people, is not even referred to. Why is that? Why was there this sort of obliteration of fact? Was there no interest or?
So I think one of the big surprises is if you look back at colonial history, that people talk that even in the 18th century and certainly through the 19th and 20th century, there was far less interest in empire and Indian affairs than you'd expect. I mean, famously, Indian debates used to, have 10 or 20 MPs bothering to attend. It's in a sense, it's the very nature of colonialism that the metropolis, is a foreign country, and the affairs of India are resting on the enthusiasms of a handful of MPs who happen to have Indian experience or some reason for taking an interest in it. And India was largely neglected in public life, when it couldn't be exploited or when its manpower couldn't be used in world wars and so on. British politicians, by and large, let it be. As for why it was neglected after the end of empire, that's in a sense a different story. That's more to do with this, I think, British sense of embarrassment. If something's embarrassing, you don't mention it. And that went, amazingly, was true for the entire history of colonialism, all 400 years of it, which more or less in the 1950s got packaged up into a series of boxes and put in the attic. In this case, the attic was the British Library. And it's only really in the last 20 years that people have begun to look. And it's still, if there's any young PhD researchers looking for a subject out there, colonialism, and particularly the early period of colonialism, is still this fantastically undiscovered world, because although there's an awful lot of theory and there's a certain amount of material on the English, work done on the English material, as soon as you get into Urdu, particularly Persian, which very few people in India speak anymore, but which was the language of government in most Indian courts, you are very often in completely virgin territory. And if you can read, for example, the 19th century Persian used in the court of, even Shivaji's courts in the 18th century and 17th century, and other courts that you would expect not to be using Persian were still using it as a diplomatic language very late on. And if you can master 18th or 19th century Persian, you can put yourself in a position of having a skill to interpret great swathes of Indian history that simply no other people have. And most of the work that's done is done in English, but even the English material, apparently there's 35 miles of this material sitting in the British Library alone. I don't know whether that figure is apocryphal or reality, but it's certainly that even that myth exists, if it is a myth. Shows how much material is out there and how very much you can find if you go in there and start calling stuff up.
In fact, Miwa asks Willie of you, he says the research of some of your books takes several years. How does one structure this research, and how do you approach this research, particularly as you may not be aware initially of what you will discover?
Absolutely right. And you have to have a system, or else you soon find yourself being swamped. I have a double system. It's quite old-fashioned. I'm sure anyone could improve on it, but it certainly works for me. First of all, I have a date line on my laptop with all the events that take place written down in chronological order. And over the course of my research, which may take 5 or 6 years, that fills out. So it starts off at 4 or 5 pages. By the time I write the book, it's sometimes 600 or 700 pages long. And with every event and with every micro event within those events, you have references to the sources where you find it, both in secondary sources or in or page references to manuscript material you found in the British Library. And you have to develop a shorthand to be able to access this stuff and locate it quickly. I then have a series of old-fashioned card indexes done by people, place, and topic. So if I happen to be writing about, taxation in the Mughal Empire, or miniature painting, or Sufism, under the topics, they'll all have entries. Ditto, if I'm writing about Robert Clive, for example, over the course of 5 years' work, I might accumulate 100 cards with material about Robert Clive, but they're all in one place under C in my people index. And by a year or two into the research, people often split into Marathas, Mughals, British, and so on. So you break it down. But the key is to have some sort of system that when you're actually writing about an event, say the Battle of Plassey, that you can easily access everything you've read about it. And I find that, you know, with a couple of days' work, you can get yourself up to speed on something you may have been researching for 5 years and locating very diverse stuff over many different archives over a long period of time. And it's that ability to bring it all together in one place to try and work out, in a sense, what's the most likely true version of events, often with conflicting accounts. And then you give that, and then I put into the footnotes what has led me to reach that result. So we talked about the Bengal famine. The Bengal famine of 1770 is an example of something which has very different figures. Some figures at the time give 3 million. Later researchers went up to 10 million. But the latest figures from the most recent specialist at JNU has put it about 1 million. So there's a long 2-page footnote in the book about why I made the particular choices in the narrative about figures and about events, and why I have dismissed certain versions but have followed other accounts very closely. So I try and keep, in a sense, the decisions about which of 2 or 3 rival accounts I followed to the footnote, so that when you read it, you get what I think the actual truth is, and then you see my reasoning. If you're a specialist and want to understand why I've gone with someone's version rather than another person's, you'll find the reason for that in the footnotes.
I'm going to, Anubhav has given us the 5-minute sign, so I'm going to just combine a couple of questions. So Pranav asks, the Dutch and the French have their own companies. However, what made the East India Company have that 2-step advantage in success? And Arunji asks, why is that British Parliament foresaw the rise of the EIC to the extent that it did in terms of power? And why Tipu was against the East India Company? Was it political or economic reasons?
There's 3 different questions. First of all, the different size, the different successes of different companies. Well, initially it wasn't the English East India Company which was the strongest. The Dutch was richer, had better ships and better sea captains. And the initial honeypot that both were after was not India at all, but Indonesia, where all the spices came from. And the British East India Company lost that battle. In 1640, they basically handed over the spice trade to the Dutch and restructured their business so that they concentrated on textiles coming out of India. And this, of course, was turned out to be a very wise decision, as the spice trade dwindled into very little, while the textile trade grew to be a massive global money spinner. And India turned out to be the center of it, particularly Bengal. And that was where the East India Company made its money. But in the long run, I think there's 2 short answers. The East India Company succeeded over other rivals of all sorts, partly because it had military superiority. Why did it have military superiority? Partly training, but partly finance. And in this, the support of Indian bankers was the crucial feature. One of the things I emphasize in the Anarchy is the degree to which Indian, particularly Mawari bankers, such as the Jagat Seths, supported the company from the outset. And without that support, there's every reason to believe that Tipu, for example, could have beaten them, because Tipu's military techniques were more than a match for the company. And then he, at Polilur and on other occasions, he defeated the company very heavily. But in the end, it was the great resources that the company had coming out of their superior financing, which in turn came out of the backing of the Mawaris ultimately, that gave the company its edge.
We're going to end with this question. Ritika asks, Willie, are we seeing history repeat itself with the social media companies that are not being regulated, and they're fundamentally altering the way democracy works?
Well, that's absolutely one of the central questions which I leave the Anarchy hanging on, because there's no question that, there are now a handful of companies, Amazon being the obvious example, is the richest 2 trillion company of all, but also Facebook, also Google, and oil companies such as ExxonMobil, all of which have annual profits greater than the GDP of most countries in the world. And that handful of mega companies do indeed have power. And just like the East India Company, they have lobbying groups, they have MPs who share their interests or parliamentarians, or if it's in America, members of the Senate or members of Congress, some of whom are paid, some of whom are bribed, some of whom just have shares. There's a whole variety of different motives involved. But you're right, companies are very powerful. And the story of the company shows that in the end, the nation state can tame an incredibly powerful company, but that the company will fight as strongly and as bitterly, using all weapons, as any nation state, to avoid that control. And the weapons that the parliamentarians of the 18th century used to tame the company are by necessity not weapons that will have much effect on a modern social media company, something like Google. If you're listening to this debate today on your mobile phone, the chances are you'll be getting feed for East India Company tea or whatever else we've been talking about in your Facebook feed tomorrow, or your Instagram feed. We are being listened to, and this, you could argue, and many people have argued, like Shoshana Zuboff in her book Surveillance Capitalism. She says this is much more power than the East India Company had, even when they had armies twice the size of the British Army. So yes, I think it's a very real, very pertinent question, and one that remains yet unanswered.
Thank you, William Dalrymple. Thank you all. I'm sorry we're not being able to take all the questions because we've absolutely run out of time. I'd like to thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation, the British Library, and of course, the Murthy Family Foundation for their support. We hope you've enjoyed the sessions and will join us tomorrow for a fabulous lineup, including Shashi Tharoor, Christina Lamb, Vikas Swaroop, Amish Tripathi, Ajit Lalwani, Roger Highfield, Edward Chancellor, Karan Thapar, Veer Sangvi, Asma Khan, and Benjamin Dix. To remember to donate to keep the arts and artists alive and support us all. And now I'm going to leave you with Jaipur Writer Shorts featuring Gemma June Howell from the University of Swansea. Have a good evening.
My name's Gemma June Howell and I'm studying for my PhD in creative writing at Swansea University. The poem I'm going to be reading today is called Bellum Omnium Contra Omnes, which translates as the war of all against all. Omnes, the war of all against all. Fractured factory ship heads into melting relic of Deception Island. Cauldron, caldera, horseshoe grave of oracle whale, doomed defender of history, fades in the black sands of blubber-bombed bay. Flesh, flenced, boiled oil shipped to slick the young guns, fenced in barbed wire, blundering in the spectra of glory, pelt of splendour, victory, lustre, mustard, sulphur, arrows, the shallows of shielded ice. In no man's land, an acoustic signature of pride strides gas blind for a sovereign shilling, price of rot sickening. Waves of scrots fester in white sludge, an avalanche of troops trudge, hating the earth beneath their boots. Solitary sailor soldiers on her humble soul, slumbering volcano, whose leviathan licks peel his weary hull. Steam, clinker, creeps, sweeps, time leaps between rift zones, magmatic mud flow grows into her own, stomping, swamping Neptune's window, swallowing lost whale bones. At the cemetery of cross-head stones, a single splintered casket of an Englishman is spat from the ground.
Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world across continents, traversing from Australia, Canada, China, Egypt, Germany, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Africa, Russia, South Korea, Sweden, UK and the USA in its stunning array of 16 international festivals in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature and so much more. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit teamworkarts.com or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.